Hello, Mark here. Before we begin today's episode, I would just like to quickly take the time to ask all of those who are enjoying the series a favour. If the platform you use to listen to Castings for Ancient Greece has a rating or review system, I would be extremely grateful if you would consider leaving the series a quick review. These ratings and reviews go a long way into helping others discover the show, in turn helping it grow. So if you enjoy the series and can spare a few minutes, I would love to read what you have to say about your experiences with the show. Thanks everyone for your support, and let's get to today's episode. Peloponnesians and allies. Our fathers made campaigns both within and without the Peloponnese, and the elder men among us here are not without experience in war. Yet we have never set out with a larger force than the present, and if our numbers and efficiency are remarkable, so also is the power of the state against which we march. King Archidamus addressing his troops on the eve of invading Attica in Thucydides' account. Hello, I'm Mark Selleck and welcome back to Castings for Ancient Greece, episode 74, Attica Invaded. We are now at a point where I know many of you have been looking forward to, including myself. We are now about to delve into the Peloponnesian War, a conflict that would engulf much of the Greek world and would last for nearly 30 years, with a couple of pauses of truce that would break the war into defined periods. Very helpful in the study of history. This war would be very different to what we have encountered so far with the Greco-Persian War. However, there would also be some similarities with what took place during the First Peloponnesian War and perhaps even the Lelantine War that took place back in the 8th and 7th century BC. Both of these conflicts had seen Greeks fight against Greeks, with coalitions form on both sides, though our understanding of these conflicts are very limited, due to the information that survives around them. We had seen that Thucydides only gives summary treatment to the First Peloponnesian War, as he sets the scene for the Peloponnesian War. A war that would surpass in greatness that of the Persian War, which he believes to hold this title previously. Thanks to Thucydides, we get a comprehensive account of the conflict since this was the focus of his work. Though we'll also be turning to other ancient writers such as Diodorus and Plutarch, who also record on events and figures during this period. However, it is Thucydides who gives us an account through almost the entire war. He was looking to try and let his fellow Greeks understand why this war came about and the consequences of it. I say almost here, as Thucydides would not end his work with the end of the Peloponnesian War in 404 BC. His work would end abruptly midway through 411 BC. It is thought Thucydides died before he could complete his work, though it is clear he had experienced the end of the war. Though we will have another ancient writer who will continue where Thucydides left off. This would be Xenophon, though perhaps not of the same calibre writer as Thucydides. We had spent quite a number of episodes looking at the period between the Persian Wars and the breakout of the Peloponnesian War. I must admit, even though it was my intention to deal with this period in detail, I didn't anticipate it taking up some 20 episodes. However, now coming out on the other side, I think it has provided a good amount of background on this often neglected period. It has also been encouraging receiving the amount of positive feedback from you, the listeners, on the approach taken here. Anyway, this has now set us up in a position to really understand why this war would break out and the many complexities behind it. I hope the last episode we did to try and tie all these elements together was useful in bringing the past 20 episodes together. Now though, we're at a point where the Peloponnesian War has broken out, and we'll be moving into the events of the first year of the war. Though, for the first part of this episode, we're going to look at what this first phase of the war would be known as, and the ironic nature around this. We will then look at the strategy that Sparta would follow going into the opening stage of the conflict, and some realities they would quickly discover. We will then turn to Athens and look at the strategy they would employ, with their intentions around certain elements still debated today. Once we have looked at how it seemed both sides would approach this war, we will then turn to the events as they unfolded, starting with Sparta's invasion into Attica and how this first year would play out. After this, we will then close the episode looking at the position both Athens and Sparta would find themselves in, and how they would respond to the first year of the Peloponnesian War. The Peloponnesian War had broken out with an action that had taken place in Boeotia, north of Attica. The cities that would be involved were not that of Athens or Sparta, but two Boeotian city-states, one of the largest in the region, Thebes, and the small polis of Plataea. The action between the two would seal the opening of the Peloponnesian War, as Thebes was an ally of Sparta's, and Plataea that of Athens, this seeing a very clear breach of the 30 Years' Peace. It would appear the move Thebes made against Plataea was somewhat defensive in nature, with them seeing war was about to break out between Sparta and Athens. Being an ally of Sparta, Thebes would find themselves at war with Athens, and before this developed, they were looking to take measures to secure their position against Athens. As we have seen, Athens was very active in Boeotia during the First Peloponnesian War, and had helped install democratic governments in many of the cities, when they moved to prevent Thebes from forming a Boeotian League under their control. This had seen that the two were hostile to one another, Thebes looking to grow their power and influence, while Athens looked to prevent the growth of power to their north. It seems that the move that Thebes made on Plataea was an attempt to secure their position against Athens for when war did come. They would have assumed that Athens would march into Boeotia like they had done in the First Peloponnesian War. However, as we'll explore a little later, it appears Athens was looking to a defensive approach on land. Plataea lay on one of the more accessible routes into Boeotia from Attica, and Thebes needed to gain control of Plataea so that they could make their own position more defensible. With Plataea being an ally of Athens, this would allow Athens a clear path into Boeotia without any opposition. Though, unfortunately for Thebes, their nighttime raid into Plataea went horribly wrong, as we saw at the end of our episode on the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War. This would see Plataea not under their control, and not only this, but Athens had taken measures to assist their ally against any further Theban attacks. As we saw, it would be with this action in Boeotia that would see the start of the Peloponnesian War. The Peloponnesian War would go on for nearly 30 years and would be marked by separate periods broken up by temporary truces. However, the first would come some 10 years away, which would see the first 10 years of the war being known as the Archidamian War. This name may sound familiar to you, as it would be named after the Spartan king Archidamus, who ironically had spoken out against war with Athens and the approach that the war party wanted to take during the conflict with Athens. Though Archidamus comes across as an honourable and proud Spartan, who was still prepared to fulfil his duty to his city. Sparta had voted for war, and he would honour his decision, even if it was at odds with his own personal opinions. He would also come to lead the Spartan army that would be sent against Attica, the strategy, he argued, that would be ineffective. Perhaps, if the second Spartan king was available, he would have been sent to command the army, with the ephors aware of Archidamus' views. Though the current Aegeid king, Pausanias, was not of age, his father Plostyanax had gone into exile after he failed to press on against Athens at the end of the First Peloponnesian War. So at this point, the Aegeid side of the kingship was being looked after by a regent, and it was customary that one of the kings should lead the Spartan forces in the field. So it would be up to Archidamus to lead the Spartan troops against Athens, with him giving his name to the opening period of the Peloponnesian War. Though, with the war now breaking out, how did both sides look to fight this war? If they were going to have a reasonable chance at success, they would need to have a long-view approach with clear objectives. To rely on their tactical strengths only would provide limited short-term success. With two large influential powers, with a whole host of cities behind them, a strategic approach combined with these tactical strengths would be needed. As the ancient Chinese general and strategist Sun Tzu once said, "Strategy without tactics is the slowest route to victory. Tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat." So let's now turn to the strategy that Sparta would go into this first period of the war with, and that would come to influence their approach for the first decade of this conflict. As we saw with the past couple of episodes, the war party had put forward their views on how war with Athens should be fought. This had been presented in the context of the congress and assemblies that Sparta had held when attempting to decide on if going to war was the right decision. It had been presented this way to convince their fellow Spartans that Athens could be defeated. Thucydides would outline that Sparta's aims in going to war with Athens was to liberate Greece and restore autonomy to those subject to Athens. As you might imagine, this was a grand aim, as Athens had spent the last 50 years establishing and maintaining the empire they would come to control. Much money and Athenian lives had been spent in ensuring Athens to reach their current position in Greek geopolitics. It would be a vast effort that would see them give up what they had made. Fundamentally, for Sparta to achieve this aim, they would need to destroy Athenian power. As Donald Kagan puts it in his book, The Archidamian War, the Spartans to require the destruction of Athenian power, that is, of Athens' walls, which made her secure against the power of the Spartan army, of her fleet, which gave her command of the seas, and of her empire, which provided the money that supported her navy. A strategy aiming at peace that left these intact was of no value. Sparta's war aims required that she must take the offensive. What we find at the beginning of the conflict was that the approach that Sparta would take in attempting to meet their war aims would be very much along the lines of what the war party had presented. As Kagan points out, Sparta must take the offensive and bring the conflict to Athens to respond to, since it was Athenian power that needed to be dismantled. Going into the war, Sparta had a vast collection of allies within the Peloponnesian League, ranging from most city-states on the Peloponnese, Boeotians, city-states around the Isthmus, a number of Corinthian colonies in the west, as well as a number of cities in Italy and Sicily. By far and away, the main strength of this combined force with Sparta at its head was their heavy infantry, or the hoplites. It's this strength that Sparta would enter the first year of the war utilising, to attempt at beginning to dismantle Athenian power. This would see Sparta direct their land forces into Attica, though they knew very well that they would not be able to march directly on Athens, with it being protected by its walls, that now stretched all the way to their port at the Piraeus. However, Sparta would look to bring the best part of the Athenian land forces out from behind their walls. To do this, they would invade during the growing season and threaten Athenian crops and the infrastructure that supported these farms. These, for the most part, lay outside Athens' defensive walls, and the thinking here was that Athens would march out to challenge the Spartans in the field to defend their resources in Attica. Sparta then, assuming their land forces were far superior, would then fight an engagement on open ground on their own terms. If the Athenian forces could be decisively defeated in the field, then this would leave Athens in a far more precarious position, and the prospect of laying siege to Athens a far less daunting task. However, assaulting the walls was still not an ideal situation. It appears Sparta did recognise that Athens could hold out for a period of time due to their connection to the Piraeus, their navy and empire. Though they thought, with the destruction of their forces in the field, they could only maintain being under siege for so long. Thucydides tells us that the Spartans going into the conflict expected they would destroy the power of the Athenians in a few years if they wasted their lands. However limiting and short-sighted this Spartan view is to us in hindsight, at the time it seemed to be a reasonable approach. Even many in Athens didn't have a positive outlook in the face of Sparta's initial approach, where Thucydides says, "Some thought that Athens could hold out for a year, some for 2, but no one for more than 3 years." So it would appear that Sparta's initial approach was to direct the strength of the land forces into Attica, where they would then ravage the countryside and draw the Athenian forces out from behind their walls, where they would then be able to engage in a traditional hoplite battle where Sparta excelled. With the Athenian army defeated, it would then only be a matter of time before the rest of Athenian power would unravel due to Athens having no way to respond to the continued raids on Attic soil, this seeing Athens in a situation where its people would only put up with these conditions for so long. So, with Sparta looking to go on the offensive and invade Attica, what was the strategy Athens looked to employ in avoiding defeat and ultimately defeat Sparta? When it comes to Athenian strategy, we have seen that they had been in the process of establishing themselves in a secure position to deal with this type of war that was now about to take place. However, as we will see, the Peloponnesian War would continue on for much longer than anyone had anticipated, where new approaches and shifts in strategy would be required. Though at this stage, Athens had prepared themselves for a land invasion of their territory. Athens' view to a threat from the Peloponnese had begun with the defeat of the Persian invasion, when they, to their displeasure of Sparta, lost no time in rebuilding the defensive walls around the city. Obviously at the time, their argument was this work was being done to protect themselves from any future Persian attacks, but Sparta's past interference in the city's dealings would have also been on their minds. Further work would be carried out on these walls to where what would be known as the Long Walls would be constructed, connecting Athens to her port, the Piraeus. This port was also a new feature of Athens' infrastructure, with it being developed after the Greco-Persian War. Athens now had a large and powerful navy, and the Piraeus would support the fleet much better. These long walls would provide a defensive corridor from the port to Athens, allowing the flow of imports to continue even if Athens were under siege. So as we can see, Athens was taking a defensive approach when it came to the land attacks coming out of the Peloponnese. During this period, assaulting a city through siege warfare was a very costly and often unsuccessful enterprise, while the Spartans were noted at being particularly bad at it. The wars would see that Athens, its trade connections, and ability to keep its population fed, would in effect neutralise the threat Sparta posed on land. Though the unknown factor here was how the Athenians would deal psychologically to their territory being invaded, and everything in Attica outside the walls at the mercy of an invading force. However, the walls would be only one factor in this Athenian defensive strategy. Their empire and fleet would provide the means for Athens to withstand continued or prolonged invasions of their territory. The years after the Persian defeat saw the establishment of the Delian League, and eventually seen as the Athenian Empire. This now saw the Aegean all the way to, and in some areas beyond the western Anatolian coast, under Athenian influence. This would see that Athens' large fleet had access to a number of trade markets, though by far and away the most important was the one that ran through the Hellespont all the way to the coastline in the Black Sea. This would be the breadbasket of Athens, and is what would allow Athens' vast population to stay fed when their own fields were being raised. At this stage too, Athens through its sheer power and wealth was also in a position of naval supremacy in the region, with no other sea-borne threats that could rival them. We had seen that this supremacy was something they actively looked to maintain, as it entered into their calculations when deciding if to get involved in the squabble between Corcyra and Corinth. Both of these cities had the next largest fleets around the Greek mainland, and if Corcyra fell to Corinth, then Corinth could potentially pose a threat to Athens on the sea. Corcyra's ships were incorporated into its fleet. So, with the situation Athens was in, as the Peloponnesian War was breaking out, Pericles would see that Athens would go into the conflict with a defensive stance. After all, it was Sparta that had to go on the offensive to meet its war aims. If Athens could cause a stalemate, then it would most likely, in effect, eventually lead to Sparta looking for terms. They could only maintain for so long fruitless invasions into Attica before resources, public opinion, and their allies would begin to waver. Pericles had summed up his strategy when he had said, "If the Athenians would remain quiet, take care of their fleet, refrain from trying to expand their empire in wartime, they would prevail." Though, like I have said, Pericles was operating in a democracy where there would always be opposition to the prevailing policy. Once war had developed and been in place for some time, how would this affect the opinion of the people? Plus, as the Corinthians had pointed out during the conquest at Sparta, there will be other ways and means which no one can foresee at present, since war is certainly not one of those things which follows a fixed pattern. Instead, it usually makes its own conditions, in which one has to adopt oneself to changing conditions. As we move through the events of the first year of the war, we will see that Athens would launch naval operations against the coast of the Peloponnese in response to Attica being invaded. It's these raids that has often seen some debate over if Pericles' policy was purely defensive. Some look to explain these operations as being defensive in nature by attempting to distract Peloponnesian forces and resources from Attica, while others see them as offensive in nature, directly targeting Peloponnesian infrastructure and the Peloponnesian allies. Though we will look closer at these when we look at these events a little later in the episode. Though, now that we have a rough idea of the basic strategy both were entering the first year of the war with, let's now turn to the events of the first year of the Peloponnesian War. The fallout from the engagement over Plataea had seen the Spartans send orders to all their Peloponnesian allies to make ready their troops and assemble their resources needed for an invasion of Attica. A steady flow of forces would begin streaming in the summer of 431 to the Isthmus of Corinth, where the campaign would be launched from. Once the combined army had assembled, King Archidamus, who would lead the forces, addressed the army. During his speech, he would urge the army to remain cautious, vigilant and disciplined. He would begin by pointing out how immense their forces were and the great strength of the combined army that was about to invade Attica. He would then follow up with, "This is no sort of justification for the least negligence upon the march, but the officers and the men of each particular city should always be prepared for the advent of danger in their own area. The course of war cannot be foreseen, and its attacks are generally dictated by the impulse of the moment. And where overweening self-confidence has despised preparation, a wise apprehension has often been able to make heed against superior numbers." Archidamus would then speak of what to expect of the Athenians when the army was in Attica, where he expected that Athens would send a force out to meet them, as this had been the case during the First Peloponnesian War. Though, if they had not dispatched a force by the time the Peloponnesians had entered Attica, he assumed they would not be able to stand behind their walls and watch their countryside being ravaged. It's interesting to note here that this part of the speech that Thucydides records is somewhat at odds with Archidamus' misgivings during the Spartan assembly. One wonders if this speech was for the benefit of morale before the army marched into enemy territory, even if it did go against his private thoughts. Archidamus would then conclude his address to the army with, "Considering, therefore, the power of the state against which we are marching, and the greatness of the reputation which, according to the event, we shall win or lose for our ancestors and ourselves, remember as you follow where you may be led to regard discipline and vigilance as of first importance, and to obey the orders transmitted to you, as nothing contributes so much to the credit and safety of an army when its soldiers, although numerous, quickly act on orders transmitted to them." Once the army had been addressed and was now poised to launch the campaign, Archidamus looked to arrange one last attempt to end the conflict before it started. He would send a herald to Athens, hoping the Athenians would back down now that they were receiving reports of vast troops assembling on the isthmus. However, Pericles, with the war beginning, had passed a motion that Spartan heralds or assemblies were not to be received. The herald was told to make sure he was beyond the frontier before the end of the day, and told to deliver a message to those who had sent him. If the Spartans wanted to make a proposition to the Athenians, then they needed to retire back to their own territory before any heralds or embassies would be received. Once the herald had returned with the news of what took place, Archidamus saw that no other options were now open to him except to begin the campaign. So shortly after this failed attempt at diplomacy with the Athenians, Archidamus would order forward the Peloponnesian forces, opening the invasion of Attica.
Hi there, are you after more Casting Through Ancient Greece episodes and would like to support the show? Well, I have some good news for you. Over on Patreon, a new bonus episode is released every month, where we look in more detail over topics that we have covered in the series so far. In this bonus series, we travel back to the earliest times of Greek history, where we then move forward, picking out interesting themes and topics to delve deeper into. This is also an opportunity for supporters to help drive what we cover in these bonus episodes. We have just wrapped up a series of episodes looking at different elements around the Ionian Revolt. Now we are heading into the phase of the Greek and Persian War, where we'll have many new angles to view this conflict from. So, if you have been enjoying the series, would like to support the show and gain access to ad-free, early access episodes, plus bonus episodes, please consider heading over to the Casting Through Ancient Greece Patreon page and supporting the show. Let's now get back to the episode.
The quickest route into Attica that had been used in past invasions was that of the coastal road that ran through Eleusis, this bringing an advancing army out into some of the most fertile land in Attica. However, this would not be the path taken by Archidamus as he led the army. Once he did get underway, it would be at a slow pace, and once reaching Megara, they would not turn south towards Athens. They instead would head in a northerly direction to the border of Attica and Boeotia, with Archidamus' sights set on the border town of Oenone. Oenone was a walled city, and with it being on the border with Boeotia, Athens would fortify it during times of war. The Peloponnesian army then set to work laying siege to the city, seeing a great deal of time devoted to this operation. This had further inflamed public opinion in Sparta against Archidamus. He was already criticised for having sympathies with Athens, for delaying at the isthmus, and marching at such a slow pace. This delay would see that Athens had some breathing space to prepare for their defences and evacuate the Attic countryside. Pericles had issued advice that the region should not go out and meet the Peloponnesians in battle, but rather collect up their property and bring their families to Athens. This would add to the defence of the city, while focus could be placed on their real strength, the fleet. This delay at Oenone would mean that a great deal of the population of the regions and their property would not become victim to the marching Peloponnesian army. This move by Archidamus was not a pointless exercise, however, as Oenone lay on the road connecting Attica to Plataea. It was also during the Peloponnesian March that a Boeotian force was advancing to meet with the Peloponnesians, and would ravage the lands around Plataea on their way. So it has been argued that Archidamus was fulfilling a strategic need that allowed the Boeotians to maintaining a line of communication to the Peloponnesians, while also cutting off Athens' access to Plataea by the main road, seeing that Plataea would have to face the Thebans without any more support coming from Athens. However, it has been argued, given the main idea of the invasion was to draw the Athenians out into Attica so that their army could be defeated, this seems like a strange first move of the campaign, as it would tie up much time. The Peloponnesians would need a good deal of time to allow them to ravage enough of Attica's countryside to motivate the Athenians to leave their walls, and as we have seen, campaigns tend to end as the colder months come on. Though, as Donald Kagan points out, perhaps Archidamus's plans were more political than strategic. He may have wanted to try and buy some more time, hoping that a settlement could be arranged with Athens before any major battles took place. Plus, he had pointed out that the lands of Attica were nothing more than a hostage for Sparta to exploit. Once ravaged, Athens had no reason to leave their walls. So, in his opinion, if the fields were allowed to grow even more fertile, the threat of Spartan ravaging would have more of a chance of eliciting a response from Athens than if they laid it all to waste. Archidamus, though, was eventually compelled to abandon the siege of One. The assaults on the city had failed, and no Athenian herald would come to negotiate. It is also possible that political considerations with his delays now needed to be addressed, or he may find his allies and his own troops less willing to continue following orders. So after some 80 days of the Theban attack on Plataea, the Peloponnesian army now marched south and turned their attention to what had been the main objective of the campaign. The lands around Eleusis were the first target of the march, and some of the most fertile. It was now that many of the crops would have been at their ripest and ready for harvest, so perhaps this was the most likely time the Athenians would respond. The army made camp at Eleusis and went about ravaging the lands around. However, the Athenians would only respond with a contingent of cavalry in an attempt to harass and disrupt the Spartan operations. No battle that the Spartans sought would be provoked, though they would put the Athenian cavalry to flight. After seeing that the ravaging around Eleusis had elicited no major response from Athens, Archidamus then had the army break camp and relocate to ravage other areas of Attica. Instead of heading to the surrounds of Athens, where they would be in sight of the defenders, Archidamus ordered the army to Acharnae, north of Athens. The reason for this move, we are told by Thucydides, was due to this being one of the largest demes where many young men came from. Therefore, a sizable contingent of Athens' hoplites came from these lands. It was then hoped that with the ravaging of these lands, these young hoplites would put enough pressure on Pericles to act, or at least see discontent behind Athens' walls build. This action had caused quite a stir in Athens, with the hoplites from Acharnae arguing for the army to sally out and meet the Peloponnesians. Pericles would deny these requests, and opinion in the city was starting to look on him unfavourably. However, as Pericles well knew, it was the passions of the people that was having this effect, as many had not known the ravaging of their lands. The last time this had occurred, on the same scale, was during the Persian invasion nearly 2 generations ago. For this reason, Pericles would also see that assemblies were suspended, as he feared the emotions of the people would see the agreed to and best path forward dispensed with, and the assembly foolishly voting for action that would play into Sparta's strength. However, for now Pericles was able to prevent a mutiny in the city, and prevented the army sallying out. He would direct energies to the defence of the walls, and would try and keep the activities of the Peloponnesians as quiet as possible, though he would permit regular cavalry actions designed to deter Peloponnesians venturing too close to Athens, where the Thessalians would also join the Athenians in these raids. With no Athenian army developing, Archidamus would continue to have his army ravage the demes extending eastward from Acharnae, though he would have seen that his warnings in the Spartan assembly were now being realised. Athens would not sit by without undertaking any operations at all, though. Pericles would see that the operations undertaken were where Athens held its strength, with its fleet. While preparations had been taking place to the lead-up of Sparta's invasion, Athens had sent envoys to all its allies that were around the Peloponnese. This was to assess if they would be able to rely on these islands and city-states when war was joined. The intention here being that they would be able to support the Athenian fleet if it looked to raid the Peloponnesian coastline. With the Peloponnesians in Attica, Athens would direct 100 triremes, along with 1,000 hoplites and 400 archers, in a naval operation against the coasts of the Peloponnese. We would hear they would be joined by 50 Corcyraean vessels, as well as other allies in the region. The fleet would set about ravaging points along the coastline, while also being strong enough to sack small cities and fend off any challenge at sea. Thucydides and Diodorus tell us about a few notable actions that were undertaken during these operations. It appears that landings were first made on the coast directly south of Sparta, where farms close to the coast were set fire to. After this, the fleet continued on to Methone, on the southern tip of the Peloponnese in Messenia. We are told that this location was picked out as there was no strong garrison in place. However, word of the attack made it to Brasidas, the Spartan general in command in this region. We will see as the war continues on, Brasidas would come to be one of Sparta's most capable generals. He would rush to Methone with 100 hoplites, where he would force his way through the scattered Athenians. He would lose a few men, but would relieve those within Methone, and would prevent its capture. He would become the first Spartan to earn thanks from Sparta for his exploits, though, as we will see as the Peloponnesian War drags on, this would not be the last time he would distinguish himself. With Methone now having a more powerful garrison, Athens would abandon the attack and would re-embark their ships. They would continue on around the west coast to Phea in Elis, where they would then turn to ravaging the countryside. They would defeat an army of 300 that had assembled to respond to their actions. Though eventually the Athenians were forced to reboard their ships, as a larger and more organised force was on the march to their position. Thucydides then tells us that raids along the coast would continue all the way up to the west coast of the Peloponnese, and north of the mouth of the Corinthian Gulf into the region of Acarnania. Here they would force some cities into the empire, while others would join willingly. Not long after these activities, the fleet would begin its journey home. This would assumably be due to the campaigning season nearing a close. We would also hear of other operations Athens would launch during the first year that were away from the defence of the city. A contingent of 30 ships would be directed against the region of Locris, this being in the area where the Battle of Thermopylae was fought. Raids would be conducted along the coast where it appears Athens was attempting to maintain lines of communication to Thessaly, who were north of Boeotia, while also securing the Euboean Gulf and Euboea from any Theban or Peloponnesian interference. It then seems, as naval operations were wrapping up in the area, Athens would have a fortified garrison established on the small island of Atlantia, just off the coast, where they had been directing their operations. This, as Thucydides says, was to prevent the coast of Euboea being raided even when the fleet had returned home. Another action Athens took in this first year of the war was to expel the inhabitants of the island of Aegina. As we had seen, Athens had taken control of the island during the First Peloponnesian War, and according to the terms that had been in place for the 30 Years' Peace, Athens was supposed to give back the island its autonomy. As we saw, this had been raised during the discussions over if Athens had breached the peace, as the island was still not free. However, with war now breaking out, there was no way Athens was going to let this happen now. Aegina had for much of their history been at odds with Athens, and being in the Saronic Gulf, which ran along the Attic coast and was home to the Athenian fleet, this proved to be a highly important strategic point in Athens' defence. If Aegina was free to do as it wished, this could see the island hosting Peloponnesian forces, disrupting Athenian activities at sea. So it was for this reason Athens would expel the inhabitants and send over a colony to ensure Aegina would stay within their possession, or more importantly, out of the possession of Sparta. The population of Aegina, for the most part, were provided a new home on the Argolid by Sparta. This, we are told, was in part due to the assistance Aegina had provided Sparta during the earthquake and subsequent Helot revolt. However, where Sparta settled this population would also prove useful in the current conditions. Aegina was hostile to Athens, for good reason, and were now settled on the closest part of the Peloponnese that Athens could make a landing on. If Athens made an attempt here, Sparta could rely on Athens meeting a tough fight. While because of Sparta's goodwill, they could also be relied upon to keep an eye on democratic Argos, not too far away. While in this first year, we would also hear of Athens pulling off a diplomatic coup, with them securing an alliance with the Thracian king, who in turn would help negotiate an alliance between Athens and Macedon. This not only helped make the Athenians stronger for the conflict, it saw that they did not have the extra worry of these states being hostile towards them, while they had this larger conflict on their hands. Another benefit this would bring would be the additional assistance by both in the war that was still going on around Potidaea. Perhaps, when we return to the events around Potidaea, we will look a little deeper into the diplomatic situation that was occurring in Macedon and Thrace at this time. It's these operations that had seen some suggest that Athens did in fact have an offensive strategy, this being argued due to the number of areas they would send forces to and them being some distance from Athens. This offensive view has also looked to the Athenians' attempts at capturing cities and establishing garrisons to show that there was intent for offensive action. However, due to the size of this force, its aims could only be limited. The attacks on cities that Athens did make were only successful when they were lightly defended. But in the examples found in Thucydides' accounts, every time a more organised force was assembled and directed to the Athenians' positions, they would retire back to their ships. While in regards to the garrison, this was established for defensive purposes, to assist with the connections to allies and their defence. For Athens' actions so far, there doesn't appear to be any operations that point to an offensive strategy at this point. Everything seems to be done for a defensive purpose, and ensuring the Peloponnesian offensive moves could be neutralised. However, that doesn't mean that these operations couldn't then lead to offensive opportunities in the future. By establishing a strong and effective defence, new opportunities could arise from what had now been established. It seems likely that the fleet's purpose, in its first year, was to avenge the ravaging of Attica. This would have helped with public opinion in Athens, while Pericles wanted to bring the realities of war home to the Peloponnesians. This way, they would understand the costs of waging war, and not have it as some faraway concept that their daily lives were unaffected by. Another effect of these naval operations was to secure more allies into Athens' camp, some willingly, others by force. While the operations and measures taken elsewhere appear to be defensive in nature, Aegina was cleared as it was too important of a location to fall under Sparta's control, being in the region of Athens' home port and where operations could have been launched from. While the activities north of Boeotia appear to be maintaining a connection to allies, as well as securing allies from attacks on their own lands. So, these are many of the activities that were taking place over the first year of the Peloponnesian War. As the first campaigning season was nearing an end, Sparta would break their camp in Acharnae and make their way back to the Peloponnese, this being at a point where their provisions were also now running low. However, as they returned, they would continue ravaging the countryside by marching a different route than they had arrived. Once entering back into the Peloponnese, the various contingents broke away from the army and made for their cities for the winter. One of the last actions that Athens would take for the season was to finally assemble all of their forces, including those of the Metics, these being the residents with rights but no citizenship. Now that the Peloponnesians had departed their lands, they would march out with Pericles leading them, and do some ravaging of their own, though not into the Peloponnese. They would focus on the Megarid, those lands around Megara. Thucydides tells us that this was around the same time that the Athenian fleet was returning from their activities around the Peloponnese, and would join the army, making this force, at the opening of the isthmus, the largest that the Athenians had yet assembled. The aim of the force was to ravage and devastate the fields of Megara, who had also had trade embargoes on them. This action would then hopefully speed up Megara's seeking terms, since they could not engage in trade freely, and they wouldn't be able to benefit from their own lands. However, there appears to be more to this invasion by Athens, as to complete this task it would only require a fraction of the force that was sent. It is thought here, after the year of the Athenians' frustrations and not being able to fight while their lands were being ravaged, Pericles gave the perception that a large military operation was being launched in response to what Athens had suffered. However, it would be launched at a time when Athens would not risk having to fight the Peloponnesian army. So as we have seen, the actions taken through the first year of the Peloponnesian War were not going to see the conflict come to a conclusion. Sparta had failed to draw the Athenians out for a decisive battle, and had not crippled its food supply. To be sure, the loss of the crops in Attica were not trivial, but while Athens retained their mastery of the sea and their trade networks, it would not bring them to a point of seeking terms. Archidamus would also receive much criticism back in Sparta for his slow campaigning, with his views on the effectiveness of invading Attica known. While we saw Athens had not just merely remained behind their walls, they had taken proactive steps to strengthen their own and their allies' positions defensively in Attica and around Greece. This would prove to make Sparta's offensive efforts much harder, while it would also provide conditions where Athens could eventually move to more offensive campaigns. Pericles had suffered a large amount of backlash in Athens due to him keeping the Athenian forces behind the walls, while their lands were being ravaged. However, he was able to maintain order and control, perhaps the naval operations, and the march of the Athenians into the Megarid at the end of the season helped quell some of these ill feelings. Well, we had quite a lot to cover in this episode, but I think we were able to touch on most of the events that had taken place. Next episode, we will start off by looking at the situation both Sparta and Athens found themselves in, now that the first year was coming to a close. However, the main part of the episode is going to be devoted to the speech that Pericles would give that would mark the end of the first year of the war. This is known as Pericles' funeral oration. It is probably the most famous speech that Thucydides puts in the mouth of Pericles in the whole of the history of the Peloponnesian War. It is a speech that has been emulated by world leaders even into our times. It is quite a long speech, though I think it is well worth reciting in full. However, we will also be looking at what he says in more detail.
Thank you everyone for your continued support, and a big shout out to all those who have found some value in the show and have been supporting it on Patreon and other various ways. Your contribution has truly helped me grow the series. If you have also found some value in the show and wish to support the series, you can head to www.castingthroughancientgreece.com and click on the Support the Series button, where you can discover many ways to extend your support to helping the series grow. Be sure to stay connected and updated on what's happening in the series, and join me over on Facebook or Instagram at Casting Through Ancient Greece, or on Twitter at Casting Greece. And be sure to subscribe to the series over the Casting Through Ancient Greece website. I hope you can join me next time when we continue the narrative in the series with episode 75, Pericles' funeral oration.